And a good morning to you. Welcome. It's Martin, Jeff, and the Farmchick coming to you high atop the Eagle Building in beautiful downtown Goodland on Eagle Cable Channel 10, KLOE AM Radio, and the World Wide Web from our Facebook page. We want to welcome you. Our show is being brought to you by Goodland Sonic Drive-In, Elliott's Home Furnishings, The Insurance Agency, Northwest Tech, and Eklund's First Insurance. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a special program for you this week. We're going to give the Farmchick and Jeff another week off this week, and we brought in Jerry Fairbanks, attorney at law here at Goodland at Fairbanks Law, Ron Veneri from Veneri and Mason, and Charles Mosier from our Sherman County attorney. Obviously, we're going to talk about some legal things, specifically related to the election coming up. And Jerry, you were the first guest I ever had on this talk show, 2001. I don't know if I always point that out to you. So it's good to have you back here. And
well, I was 3 or 4, Marty.
Yeah, well, I was. I don't know about you. That was a long time ago, 15 years ago.
Shortly, I think it was right after 9/11.
Right.
Yeah.
We kind of created the show to kind of bring a local spin to issues, and not only local issues, but what's going on in the world. And today we want to talk about what's going on in the state of Kansas. I don't stay up to date on what's going on in Kansas as well as I should, because I get a lot of the Denver media, and I miss out on some things that I should be knowing about. But there's something going on the ballot this time around that maybe we ought to talk about a little bit. This past reunion, my classmate, who I always considered a great friend in high school and hadn't seen her for many years, Marla Lukert, was back, and we had a great visit. And Marla just happens to be a Kansas Supreme Court justice. And I remember when she was appointed. She was appointed, wasn't she, originally?
She was, yes.
And we were, I thought that was great. One of our classmates doing achievement. A lot of my classmates were overachievers, and I don't know what happened to me, but she did well, and we were very proud of her. But there's a ballot question that people need to know more about that we're only hearing really from news or from television ads and so forth regarding the retention of the Supreme Court justices, and specifically Marla and others. How many others? Are just 2 of them?
No, I think there's 5 justices that are up for retention, Marty. Supreme Court justices this year.
What is the law in Kansas in terms of retaining Supreme Court justices and or appointing them?
Well, we'll start from the beginning, and I'll kind of go through this process, and then I will let the experts, Charles and Ron, talk to you about the specifics. But the way the Supreme Court is picked now, Marty, and it has been for a long number of years, is that there is a Supreme Court nominating committee that exists, and that committee consists of attorneys and possible judges, not Supreme Court judges, and lay people. And there are 2 people from each congressional district that are on this committee, plus a chairperson. So we have 4 congressional districts, so there are 8 people that are on the nominating committee, and in each one of those districts there is an attorney and a layperson that's on there, and then there is a chairperson. For the first district, the attorney is Dave Rabine. Dave is a practicing attorney. I actually went to law school with Dave, and he's in Dodge City, Kansas. And the individual who's from our congressional district is Linda Weiss. She's from Manhattan. So this group, if you want to become a Supreme Court justice and there's a vacancy, you can fill out an application. One of your sponsors is Sonic. Maybe, I don't know if it's a lot different than the Sonic application or not, but you fill out an application, and it's submitted to this group. This group will look at all of the applications, and I'm not privy to exactly what they do, but I know how difficult it is to submit an application and to be one of the people that is ultimately presented to the governor by this group. So you go through that process, and this committee picks 3 individuals for the one spot to be appointed. Those 3 names are then submitted to the governor, and the governor makes the appointment to the Supreme Court. Now, once you're appointed, you become up for attention. I think it's every 4 years. It's every 4 years. So once you're appointed, every 4 years, your name is on the ballot to either retain or not retain you as a Supreme Court justice. So that's how you are currently. That's how Marla was appointed to the court.
Now, these 5 that are seeking to be retained, have they been on for longer than the 4 years? Or were they new 4 years ago?
Well, one of them has been on a very short period of time, and that's Justice Stegall. Justice Stegall is the only appointee on the court, on the Supreme Court, that's been made by our current governor, Sam Brownback. But he is up for retention. The others are longtime justices that have been there. The chief judge, who's from Salina, Marla Lukert, who's from Goodland, and Justice Beyer, who I think is from, I don't know, Hutchison or McPherson or somewhere, are the most senior justices. So they are all up with Justice Stegall, and I can't remember who else is up. But
Justice Biles.
Justice Biles. The 5 of them are up for retention this time.
And are we thinking that justices are going to be appointed or retained because of political reasons?
Well, it's a really good question. We don't, it's hard to tell. What's interesting, Marty, and I guess no one, I don't want to say no one, but most people have not taken into consideration retention of judges. You walk into the voting booth, it says, do you retain or not retain these judges? Most people don't know who they are, could care less who they are, and generally I think have just said retain or don't retain, but it's never really been an election that I'm aware of where a justice has not been retained. Either one of you?
I'm not aware of a Supreme Court justice not being retained.
Right. So what's happened is that the legislature, a couple of years ago, we have the Supreme Court, which consists of 7 justices. And I'll talk. I don't want to do all the talking, but we have our court system, Marty, is basically four layers to kind of get to where we're going. There's the very basic, I want to call magistrate county court, where we have a magistrate judge who either can be a lawyer or a non-lawyer judge that handles probate matters and misdemeanors. Then we have district judges. We have a district that we're all in that consists of 7 counties. 7 counties. And we have 2 district judges. Those are the trial judges. Those are the judges that when there's a trial or there's a dispute, they handle those, and they're all lawyer-trained judges. If you are disappointed or the loser in a case, you have an absolute right to appeal that case to the Kansas Court of Appeals. Okay? The Kansas Court of Appeals is the interim appellate court. And I think there are 14 justices that sit on it, and they sit on 3-judge panels. So they move around. They don't have So if we have an argument for the Court of Appeals, I had one not too long ago, you don't know which 3 justices are going to be assigned to hear your case. And when something is appealed, it's only appealed on certain legal issues that the court doesn't retry the case. There's no jury. There's no nothing. It's a oral argument. You filed briefs with the court, and the court then hands down a decision. The next court after that's the Supreme Court. Things that get to the Supreme Court are cases that come from the Court of Appeals that they agree to hear on certiorari, and cases that have real constitutional issues, as well as which criminal cases. I know any murder cases, there are certain, depending on the severity of the case, you have an appeal directly to the Supreme Court on those kinds of cases.
Class 1 felonies.
Yes.
Class 1 felonies. So it's not just murder, it can be several different things that come up. Charles deals with that on a day-to-day basis.
Okay.
So what's happened is the legislature changed the way we appoint the Court of Appeals judges a couple of years ago to make it mirror what we do in the federal system. And what that is that we've done away with the Supreme Court nominating commission for Court of Appeals judges. The governor picks a choice and submits that choice to the Senate. The Senate confirms that person, and it's done. That wasn't done with the Supreme Court because right now the way the Supreme Court's done is constitutionally mandated, and it would take a constitutional amendment to the Kansas Constitution to change that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where we are now.
So therefore, there is a ballot question on our ballots in the state of Kansas. I've seen the street signs. Vote yes or no to retain these justices. Explain what this. Let's get right to the point on the ballot question.
Well, the ballot question, there's going to be, I can't remember. Do you guys know? There are Court of Appeals justices and Supreme Court justices on this ballot.
That's correct.
Ron's wearing his "I voted" sign, so he may know exactly how many there are. Do you know,
I
Ron?
know more Court of Appeals justices than Supreme Court justices, but I didn't count them.
Yeah.
And I voted 3 hours ago, but I didn't count the number.
So the question becomes, and Marty, as I said earlier, this has never been an issue. And I'm going to give you my opinion, no one else's opinion, is that it's become an issue because I think that some of our public officials in Kansas are upset with the Supreme Court concerning school funding issues. The argument has always been that school funding is a legislative and not a judicial function, which is absolutely true. But our Constitution says, to make it really simple, as we've all been told by one of the judges who helps make those decisions at the district court level, is that funding to be constitutional has to be adequate and equal. Those are the things, and the Supreme Court has found several times that the legislature's not done that. So I think this all stems from that we want to get rid of these justices because we don't like the way they're making rulings, and that's the heart of the matter. And that's what we really want to talk about today, I think, is what's the function of the Supreme Court justices, what they do, and why we think it's very important to keep an independent judiciary. Because I can tell you, all three of us sitting here at this table have been upset by rulings made either by the Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court. And I hear people say, well, we don't like the ruling, so they're activist judges. That doesn't make them an activist judge. It just means they made a decision that was not in your favor or you didn't like. But they do that to everybody. Mm-hmm. I mean, when there's a winner, there's a loser. And so we've all been on that side of the table.
And I'd like to address Marty's question about the politics of the election. There are 5 justices up for retention, and those who support getting rid of 4 of those justices support Justice Stegall, who was supported and appointed by Governor Brownback. Does that not spark politics? So let's just get real about that. Yeah. And so the problem about mixing politics with a judiciary is that judges need to call them like they see it, like an umpire in sports. And I have faith in the judges that we have that they're doing just that. As a matter of fact, on this very issue that Jerry's talking about with the school funding, it went first to the Court of Appeals, and I personally know 2 of the 3 people on that panel of the Court of Appeals. One of them was a fraternity brother of mine in college at Pittsburgh State. The other was Judge Jack Burr. And they made their ruling. These are honest men who made an honest call. But they made a call that some people politically didn't care for. And the Supreme Court supported their decision of the Court of Appeals. And people still didn't care for that support of that issue. But where does it end, Marty? I mean, where do you end with this political thing? 5 years from now, we have Democrats controlling all of Kansas, which would be hard-fetched to believe. Jerry would like that as a Democrat, but it would be far-fetched to think the Democrats would control. But if they did, should then the Democrats say, let's don't retain these Republican judges because we don't like the way they vote? And you get yourself, you whipsaw into a judiciary that's dependent upon politics instead of an independent judiciary that should call it like they see it.
Jerry, you talked about the school funding and the Constitution and how the current Supreme Court justices are interpreting that. If they're all shoved out and a different, an all-Republican group comes in, are they still bound by that same criteria, or are they going to interpret things, the school funding issues, in a different way? And that's politics, right?
That's politics. And that's, Marty, I don't know, because we don't know what they would do. You would hope, and I'm going to give you an example. I was at a meeting this summer with 2 of the justices, Justice Breyer and Justice Lukert. And the question was asked of them, how does politics come into being when you are, 7 of you are making a decision? And they both said, number one, we don't know if our justices that serve with us are either Democrats or Republicans. And we don't want to know. We don't know what their religious affiliation, if any, is. Because we have to make decisions based on what the law is and based on what we perceive it to be, not based on our own personal opinions. I'm going to let Charles talk about this in a minute, but one of the things that is being promoted on TV is get rid of these justices because of what they did with the Carr brothers case. Anybody who knows anything about the Carr brothers case knows it's one of the most heinous crimes that was ever committed in the state of Kansas. The Kansas Supreme Court never overturned their convictions. We're never going to let them out of jail, but determined in their sentencing that some things may have not done exactly the way it should have been in accordance with the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution, which is unusual punishment, and said we need to send that back. Not that they were going to let them go, but send it back to look at the sentencing. Went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said we disagree with the Kansas Supreme Court. We think the sentencing was fine, and they should still be sentenced to death. Now, was the Supreme Court right and the Kansas Supreme Court wrong? I'm not going to tell you it was, but it's the final arbiter. That's it. That's as far as it goes. So they're using that as, well, look at what these justices have done. They are letting criminals out of jail or those kinds of things, and that's not happening at all.
And that's what a lot of the advertising
That's
is
what the
saying,
advertising is about. I will tell you, if you talk to any one of those 5 justices that are up for retention, they would tell you that they absolutely unequivocally would never, ever let the Carr brothers out of jail, or that they should be out of jail. Or they would probably tell you, we didn't like making the decision we did, but we felt compelled to do that because that's what the law was.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I want to add on, Marty, just a couple of the comments. I think preface my comments first with something I've always said, and that is the courtroom is no place for politics. But unfortunately, I think with this retention ballot issue that we're seeing this year, to respond to one of your earlier questions, I think it's very political, especially what we are seeing in terms of the campaign to ask our citizens to vote not to retain the Supreme Court justices. I do believe what Jerry said is absolutely spot on. I think it probably the main motivating factor for that opposition to retain the justices is the school funding issue. But it's not as sexy as death penalty issues. It's more complex and not as easy to explain to the voters. And so they have latched on to the Carr brothers case as their flag that they're waving. Look how horrible our Supreme Court has been, how erroneous their rulings have been. It is time to bounce them out. But probably the unfortunate thing about that is, and very shameful, is how misleading and deceitful the ads are about the Carr brothers case. It leaves the viewer with the idea that the Supreme Court essentially set the Carr brothers, our Kansas Supreme Court essentially set the Carr brothers free. And as Jerry said, it is probably the most heinous criminal spree in Kansas history. Certainly in recent Kansas history. These are 2 brothers who went on a week-long crime spree that ended with execution-style murders on a soccer field in Wichita, where they shot, in execution style, 5 people, 4 of which died. And so it is horrible. But what essentially happened is the Carr brothers were tried together and were sentenced together, and in the sentencing phase, they were given the death penalty for 4 of those murders, and it went on appeal to the Kansas Supreme Court. The Kansas Supreme Court ruled that 2 errors occurred at the sentencing phase. One was that they should not have been sentenced together in the same proceeding. That each of the brothers should have received separate sentencings. Because they were sentenced together, they thought that there were some prejudicial effect and said basically we're going to vacate these sentences, and that was it. They vacated the sentences. They weren't setting the Carr brothers free. And the second error they found is that during the sentencing phase, a jury is the prosecution has to present what they call aggravating circumstances to essentially justify the imposition of the death penalty, and the defense can submit mitigating evidence. And the jury was not instructed that the defense's mitigating evidence does not have to reach the same level of beyond a reasonable doubt burden. And that was the other reason. Ultimately, in 2016, the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, Kansas Supreme Court, you were wrong in the sense that we don't find that sentencing the two Carr brothers together was prejudicial. It's often done. They basically looked at the evidence that was presented and said nothing was done wrong, and agreed that they didn't have to instruct the jury as to the burden of proof for mitigating circumstances. So essentially all they did was reinstate the death penalty that had been vacated by our Kansas Supreme Court. No one was set free, as viewers are led to believe, and unfortunately it's. As I said, I think it's very shameful, very deceitful that opposition is using that in the manner that they are. There are 4 former governors of the state of Kansas who have come out and said that this campaign against the Supreme Court justices is horrible.
And most of those Republicans, probably.
Yes, that is correct. And they are urging the retention of the Supreme Court justices. Mm-hmm. It's really a power grab. I would call it as I see it, and this is only my opinion. It's a power grab by the Brownback administration. Mm-hmm. They were successful in getting new legislation passed in 2013, as Jerry was talking about, that changed the way the Court of Appeals judges are nominated and selected, so that it gives so much more power to the governor in this situation, Governor Brownback, and then approval by the Senate. That was at the height of probably the power by the Brownback administration. They have talked about the idea of floating an amendment to the Constitution that will change the Supreme Court Nominating Commission and the way it is selected to, again, give that power to the governor. And we have a separation of powers in our government for a reason. There are 3 separate branches, and they need to remain separate and not give so much power to the executive branch.
And this issue is just kind of like part of the entire wild-eyed, crazy election season that we have this year, and bringing some of those people in. Just like you said, Ron. I mean, when we go to vote to retain justices or judges or whatever. I don't even know who these people are, and they're usually running unopposed. So you either vote for somebody or you don't.
And another point I'd like to make, Marty, if you listen to County Attorney Charles Mosier's explanation of the legal questions presented, and if you didn't go to sleep as a layperson, because they're technical legal questions. Now,
right.
Fairbanks and Veneri understand what Mosier's saying, but most people don't, because it's technical legal questions. These judges weren't saying, we're going to be soft on the Carr brothers and let them go. Right. That's what people are thinking. The judges made a bona fide decision that the Supreme Court justices disagreed with and sent the case back. Happens all the time. It is a matter of questioning their legal interpretation, not questioning whether or not the Carr brothers are going to be let loose. The Carr brothers were 20 and 23 years of age when they committed this crime. They are now 35 and 38. Their appeals still aren't over, but they have not seen freedom since they were arrested. And they will not, and they could still face the death penalty. So,
I failed to tell you, gentlemen, that this show is a half hour long, and we're down to about 4 minutes left. So
what happens? You get 3 lawyers together.
So no pun intended, but I would throw this out for closing arguments here amongst you.
The closing argument, Marty, from my perspective is I totally agree with Charles. I think this is a power grab. It's not based on anything having to do with what the Supreme Court did with the Carr brothers. It's that the administration is upset with the school funding. They don't like what's happened with school funding. and that makes it much more difficult. We're not going to get into that issue as far as the tax structure and why what has happened with it under this administration. So to tell people, take these television advertisements with a grain of salt, and you need to understand. And I'll get off my soapbox. All of the money for this campaign is coming from outside the state of Kansas.
Wow. Nobody knows that, of course.
No.
Right.
And I'd like to say that my wife, Judy, is, I consider, the average voter. And she comes to me and she said, what did these justices do wrong that we ought to kick them out? This is what the average voter's thinking. And my answer was nothing. And she said, fine with me. Now, often she doesn't agree that readily with me. But in this instance, she did. And you've now heard the explanation this afternoon as to the fact that they have not done anything wrong.
Charles?
Marty, I've had more people this year come and ask me about the judicial retention questions on the ballot because of the advertising that they're seeing. And I'm glad that they're doing it because, as we've talked about, your average citizen doesn't have the contact with the courts that we do as lawyers. But I would say this. There was a recent poll by Fort Hays State University that showed Kansans had more trust and support for the court system than any other branch of government. But yet, unfortunately, our politicians in Topeka continue to attack our court system. And it's, frankly, time to end that. It's time for the voters of Kansas to send the message, and they can do that by saying yes and retaining our justices on the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeals.
I have to admit that before we did our program, and the show is pre-recorded, I went out and asked 2 or 3 average citizens, like you mentioned, Ron, all of them Republicans. And every one of them were familiar with this issue, more than I was. And every one of them said, I'm voting yes to retain because it's nonsense what's being said about this whole issue. And again, I've got a personal thing because Marla Lukert is a good friend, a classmate, and I think she's done a good job and a fair-minded job as Supreme Court Justice representing from Goodland, Kansas.
Well,
So-
and Marty, all of these justices, I'm not going to say all of them, but these justices come from small towns. They're people just like us. They don't have an axe to grind. They are very, very experienced. They're very intelligent. And we don't always agree with them, but they're the final arbiter, and they're not people who go out on a limb and do really stupid things like they're being
They're not
charged
arbitrary
with. They're
people.
not arbitrary people.
The bottom line is, if you don't know how you stand on this issue, find out. Get the facts.
Yes.
Don't rely on anybody who watches any of the advertising, whether it be for the presidential race. It's aggravating. It's nonsense. It's ridiculous. And I haven't seen any of the Kansas ads, but that's what I'm hearing from these everyday people that I talk to. So get the facts.
Get the facts.
And we thank you for bringing this to our attention. And I suppose if they would like more information, they could talk to any one of you as well.
Yes. Thank you for having us on.
Yeah.
You bet.
Yes, thank you.
Appreciate it.
We'll be back again next week. The Farmchick and Jeff will be in. We're going to talk about the election, maybe more details on regional and local races. So tune in for our pre-election show next Wednesday morning here on Martin, Jeff, and the Farmchick. Our show is brought to you by Eklund's First Insurance, Northwest Tech, The Insurance Agency, Goodland Sonic Drive-In, and Elliott's Home Furnishings here on Eagle Cable Channel 10, KLOE AM Radio, and on the World Wide Web from our Facebook page. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you again next week.